Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 22 of Opening Basics. In this video we're going to take a look at the Philidor Defense. So let's go ahead and put it on the board. We're looking at the moves e4, e5, the e4, e5 openings, knight f3, the main move, attacking the pawn. And now, previously we looked at the counterattacking moves, the Petrov defense with knight to f6, counterattacking the e4 pawn, or the various gambit moves, the Latvian gambit with f5, or the the elephant gambit with d5. What we're going to look at now is just a simple defensive move, which is your option to attack or defend, and a pretty reasonable move, it turns out, the Philidor Defense. Now, it has a reputation of being somewhat stodgy or old-fashioned, so you don't see it so much, but you can actually get quite a decent position out of it as black, and it's maybe interesting to play because your opponents may not be expecting it. They may underrate the opening and start playing somewhat casually. And you can play this opening. You'll end up with kind of a cramped position as black typically, but you can play for an end game where you get all your pieces out, and there's not so many trades, so you can play for a long game and for activity in the end game, in the middle game, I meant to say. So interesting opening. The main move for white here to try and put immediate pressure on the center is d4. But, well, first let's look at the bishop c4 move. That's the second choice, and also an interesting way to play. White is immediately setting up for potential tactics on the f7 pawn, so always have to be alert for that. But what you can play here as black, which is not so easy after d4, is you can play knight to c6, another move that helps to defend the center, so you're shoring up the center here. And then if white carries on with d4, which is the main move, this is a good point to actually surrender the center, and that's the first theme I wanted to introduce in the Philidor, which is you often want to just give up your center pawn. You want to hold on to it for a little bit maybe, but then give it up at the right time. I guess that's the attitude you should have with the Philidor. So this is called surrendering the center, because after that trade, white has a pawn in the center, and black's pawn is back on d6, so it's not technically in the center, and white has a little more space. So there's some slight advantage here, but it's not so bad. Play can continue, say bishop e7. You want to develop the kingside pieces as black to get your pieces out. White can castle here, and then knight f6, developing another piece, and knight to c3, and then say black castles. And this is the kind of position that you're looking for. It's all the pieces are still on the board. White has a slight edge in space, but he's not overrunning black by any means. And I think, you don't see this so much at the top level, because this does require black to defend for some time. White can maybe try and squeeze the position for a while. But I think why I've had no trouble playing this. It seems to be perfectly playable. One point here is that white can many times take this knight and damage the pawn structure. It could be played right here, but it's usually not considered the best move. If I look at this position, let's see, the top choice here is rook to e1, or developing the bishop to f4, just normal developing moves. This move to grab, to trade knights and damage pawns, black's pawns, is a double-sided move. This may be a long-term weakness. Perhaps in the endgame those pawns might become weak. But in the middle game, those pawns are controlling a lot of squares. And also black has been given an open file for the rook. So it's not like black has an advantage in this position. It's just that it's pros and cons, and white hasn't necessarily gained anything by that transaction. And by the same token, black doesn't have anything to fear, so there's no need to really defend that knight on c6. You can just allow that trade to happen. Okay, so that's the couple ideas I wanted to introduce. There's another line after bishop c4. White plays bishop c4, so knight c6 is what I'd recommend here. But there is another line in the opening book, bishop to e7, and this is a bit tricky. But what black is trying to do is control the g5 square to prevent this knight g5 move, because, like I said, there's potential threats on the f7 pawn. White can castle here, but I think the most direct response is to play d4 here. And now knight c6, if it's played here, is not quite as good. You can play knight c6, but now you haven't had the chance to surrender the center. So white can grab this trade. He can trade these guys and then trade queens. And now you don't want to take back with the knight because you would be giving up the e-pawn. You don't want to take back with the king because you'd lose castling privileges, so you take back with the bishop. And this is a position where white is just a little bit more comfortable. Let's see, knight c3 is a normal move, just keeping on developing. White has a lead in development in a symmetric pawn structure. And this piece is going to take another move to get developed. So say bishop to e7 here. Knight f6 could have been played there too, but this bishop has to come out at some point. And then bishop to a3. You see that white maintains basically an extra move in development, and he's going to be quicker getting his rooks onto the open file. So there is a fairly significant edge to white in that position. So that's why it's not quite as good. After bishop e7, let's see, instead of knight e6, knight c6, you can once again surrender the center, and that's probably the best way to play it. Knight takes d4, and then you transpose into something that we've seen before, castles and knight to f6. So all that is reasonable. One trick or trap to watch out for here. Say after knight takes, and then suppose you were worried about the knight taking on knight to c6, and you play the move bishop to d7. I've done things like this in the past, where I want to be able to bring my knight out to c6 and not have to worry about the doubled pawns. This is actually losing immediately because of the move queen h5, putting pressure on f7, and it's awkward to defend. You can bring the knight out to h6 to defend it, but the bishop can chop it off. So that doesn't really help. Let's see, what's the best choice here? g6, kicking the queen, and then the queen runs over to d5. So you see the queen has two squares from which it can attack the f7 pawn. So you really have to be tactically alert. Let's see, the only defense here is bishop e6 trying to block. And now white has a pleasant choice. He can take on b7 and threaten the rook over here, or he can just grab the bishop and win a pawn immediately. But both of these are winning positions for white. So you do have to be careful with this bishop e7 move. That's why I don't recommend it. In this position after bishop c4, yeah, you got a choice. You have a choice between knight c6 or bishop e7, and I really recommend the knight c6 move there. Okay, so that's enough. Let's go to the main line. After d6, really d4 is the main line for white, and this is what you usually will see when you play the Philidor. And now knight c6 is no longer so good, because once again, with the pawn already in the center, white can just take and then trade queens, and this leads to a good position for white. Black is going to lose the castling privileges or lose the pawn. If knight takes, he loses the pawn. If king takes, he loses castling privileges, and white can develop with tempo, bishop to c4, hitting this pawn, which is undefended, and if the bishop comes out, he can take the bishop and double the pawns. So this just leads to a long-term edge for white, and it's very comfortable. So you don't really want to play that way as black, but there are ways to play this. One idea is knight d7, the Hanim variation, and I'm mentioning this not because it's good here, but because a lot of times you'll try to get to the Hanim variation by other means. The immediate knight d7 is not quite so good, but the original idea of the Hanim variation was to bring knights out to d7 and f6, and then play c6 and have this very solid center and having the knights supporting each other. And it's a pretty interesting setup where you can expand on the queen side and you're pretty solid on the king side, and you're holding on to the center. But in this particular case, the move bishop to c4 poses some problems for black, so they don't generally play this way anymore. If you want to continue, the main line here is c6, trying to get these pawns set up. Just another trick to watch out for: if you play knight to f6 right away, trying to go for the setup, there's a problem here where d takes, and you can't take with the pawn if you thought you were holding on to that pawn because of knight to g5. and knight to g5 is now a threat on f7 that can't be met. So that's a big problem. So after after pawn takes, you have to take back with the knight, so you're prepared to defend f7, and then after this trade of knights, you can throw in bishop takes f7 check, and typical kind of tactic you have to be aware of in these openings. So king can't take the bishop because his queen, he would lose the queen, so he has to go here. And now you can just trade queens here or retreat the bishop. I guess technically the most accurate is trade queens here. King takes, and then the bishop is not even under threat. Just defend your e-pawn, and you're a pawn up, and with a good position on top of it. So those are the problems with trying to play this Hanim variation, the Hanim variation immediately, and knight f6. That was typical tactics you get. So let's back up. In this position after d4, the top choice here is just to take. And then you take back, knight to f6 now, counterattacking the e-pawn, bringing out a defender. And bishop to e7, bishop to e2. We get quite a reasonable setup. Both sides are going to castle. And once again, let's see, it's black's turn. Black castles, white castles. And knight to c6 can be played here, or rook to e8. I would c5. The chess engine actually is recommending c5. This is really interesting. c5 is not popular in the opening book, but I have seen that played a fair amount. So this is as far as I'm going to go with the main line of the Philidor, but that c5 idea is something to keep in mind. It looks like a really ugly move, but it kicks this knight away from this good square on d5. And I've always played this with something like knight c6. Like I said, no need to fear the trade of the knights, and then the bishop can come out later, and once again you get a solid position that you can play as black. If we back up, and if you want to go for this c5 move, that's a more interesting way to play. I can't say much about it, except that the chess engine is recommending it there. Okay, let's back up. There's one more point I wanted to mention about d4. After d4, we looked at two of the knight moves, knight c6, knight d7. We looked at surrendering the center. There is also the counterattacking move, knight f6, and you can play this, going after the e-pawn. And the idea is that after white takes, which is probably the best move, you don't take back and allow the trade of queens, but you take the pawn here. And this leads to kind of an interesting position for black. Let's see, there's different ways to play it. White can go with bishop to c4 here. Let's go ahead and put this on the board. Bishop to c4, threatening maybe knight g5 and taking on f7. c6 is an interesting way to counter that, to prepare the move d5 to block the bishop. And the other way to play it for white is queen to d5. Bringing out the queen early, hitting the knight, maybe thinking of playing bishop to c5 at some point. But there's a defensive resource here, which is knight to c5. And this defends the pawn on b7 so that this bishop is free to come out to e6 and chase the queen away. So this knight c5 move is really important in this position if you're going to play that knight f6 line. And this is, once again, a position you can play. I guess the most active move for white in this position is bishop to g5, and then you can block it with bishop to e7. Then finally there's this exchange on d6. Let's see, if we take with the pawn, it is going to be an isolated pawn, but this is a position where black actually has a slight edge in development. White's got a queen out, but he's not in any position to castle, whereas black is going to be able to castle and his pieces are active. So once again, a playable position for black. So that actually concludes everything I wanted to say about the Philidor in this video. I'm going to talk about a few more lines in the next video related to the Philidor. So I'm going to talk about the Neo-Philidor, ways to get into the Hanim Variation without suffering the problems that we saw in this video. And I'm also going to talk about the Philidor counter gambit and the Damiano defense. So stay tuned for that. See you then. Bye.